You've been busy, Andrea. That is quite the exhibit that's coming together. So many wonderful stories.
Thank you. It was a lot of fun to look into the artifacts that will be involved in this exhibit for sure.
That's excellent. People, if you have questions, please post them in the Q&A, and I will be reading them off to Andrea, and she's going to answer them. Kevin is asking, was it possible to transfer from active to alternative service in 1941?
That's a good question. There are people probably online who are more expert at this than I am. I've heard stories of conscientious objectors going to the military. I have not heard stories of people coming from active service and going in the opposite direction that way.
So maybe if you know something about that, you can post in the Q&A.
Mm-hmm.
John Jansen is asking, are there any records of Mennonites who were in the alternative service during the First World War? Who and where? Do you know where the records for that type of thing would be found from the First World War?
I would imagine that an archive would be a good bet for that. And I would imagine Mennonite Heritage Archives, at least from the Canadian perspective, Mennonite Heritage Archives in Winnipeg or the Mennonite Archives of Ontario would be very good places to look for records like that. I'm sure they are also in federal government archives as well, but that might be a little bit trickier to find.
Okay, great. John mentions that his uncle was in the forest eye during the First World War in southern Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And I'll say our collection of artifacts for the First World War, we don't have as many as we do for the Second World War. So going back to the earlier wars that Mennonites had some kind of reaction to or involvement in those, for a museum, they're trickier to have artifacts in your collection about those. We do have a few, but.
Okay, not as many. And Becky is wondering if you can speak more about the German POW camp at Riding Mountain, the national park that you mentioned.
Yeah, that did exist at the same time that the CO camp was there. And I think I mentioned it in the video that the COs were actually producing the lumber for the camp. It's interesting when you look up the history of Riding Mountain National Park, their own history talks more about the POW camp on the park grounds than it does the conscientious objector camp on the grounds. So I don't think that there are very many remnants of that camp left. I know that they said, because it was located where it was a pretty secure camp, so they didn't have to have barriers around it. It was bush, so you couldn't get very far. But yeah, it's very interesting that the national park itself focuses more on the German POWs than the COs there.
Okay. And Dan is wondering when the exhibit will open, and you said spring 2021?
We're aiming for late May.
Late May.
Yeah, this year with our first year of kind of COVID upheaval, we made it for June, I think it was. We typically open exhibits in late May. So right now I'm saying we're aiming for that, but COVID throws a wrench in a lot of different things. But that's our plan.
That's great. Dan says he's planning to come visit when it's open.
Perfect.
And Robert is saying, I once knew a man who was forced to serve both with the Soviets and the Germans during World War II. Have you any such testimonies at the museum?
That happened quite a bit for Mennonites because they were ethnic Germans. First, they were pulled into the Red Army. Then when they were captured by the Germans, then they were pulled into the German Army. So there's, I know in my own family history, that was the case as well. So there are many stories like that where they were seen as Germans in some respects and seen as Soviets in other respects. And sometimes were pretty nimble with that identity depending on the circumstances and the circumstances of war at the time. But that's a fairly common story. Yeah.
Yes. Joanne mentions that her mother also worked at the Henry Ford Hospital as a nurse in the late 1930s.
Neat.
Yeah. Virginia is asking, what do you know about the leather jacket that was hanging near the other objects?
Right. That was a jacket that I really wanted to include. It's a story of a conscientious objector, but we just didn't have the time. And because the Riding Mountain Sawmill was part of the video already, I thought, well, we've dealt with conscientious objectors. The jacket belonged to Alman Reimer. He was from Steinbach here, and he was a conscientious objector. And his story is really neat. His jacket, he donated it in 2014. and he has since passed away. And so I was able to talk to him about this, and he's a very soft-spoken man. So the story behind the jacket is he packed up, he was heading to a sawmill near Roblin, Manitoba, and he talks about he'd never left home before, and this was this was a common story for conscientious objectors. They're leaving rural farming environments that are pretty insular, and they're heading out and seeing all kinds of, a big wide world out there. So he talks about boarding the train in Winnipeg, and he looks around, and there's just Air Force personnel on the train, and he's the only one in civilian clothes, and he has his little satchel of stuff. And every time the story was told, I saw it told in his obituary as well, he always mentions that the axe that he took along, the axe handle was sticking out of his bundle. So I guess he found that pretty conspicuous. So he said, in a very soft, kind of soft spoken sort of a way, he said, I just put my head down and I didn't really say much that train ride. He spoke to that feeling of tension between conscientious objectors and military, and maybe even with the rest of society, who sort of looked at conscientious objectors and thought maybe they were shirking their duty. I've heard stories of like that, stories similar to that too, where they find themselves in the midst of an environment where there's more military people than anything, and they just say, I think on The Last Objectors, the documentary about this, is one conscientious objector said, "You wouldn't believe how many times I went to the bathroom on that train ride just to be away out of his seat." You can just imagine what that would feel like at the time. So
Yeah.
that's the story of the leather jacket belonging to Almond Reimer.
Well, I wonder if it's a relative, because Virginia is a Reimer too. So
Okay.
maybe she'll have to come see it. And Dan is wondering, how did the Heritage Center or the Heritage Village procure the sawmill?
That was interesting. So our current head sawyer, he's a volunteer here at the museum, and I spoke to him about a year ago. We do have records on how buildings ended up here. The sawmill had some gaps in the record, but he mentioned that his father had been involved in getting it directly from Riding Mountain National Park and bringing it to the museum, and that was about 1972. And then he was involved in restoring it, so it was restored to its original usage and look as it would have had during World War II. The sawmill actually was out of commission for us for just over a year, I think, and our head sawyer led a team of volunteers that restored the sawmill completely to bring it back up to operational capacity for us. So this was our first year in a couple years running it the way we did. So it's a pretty neat story.
That's great. And what is a sawyer?
The person who saws the lumber, who
Okay.
manages, yeah, who manages the sawmill.
Okay. Okay. I missed what city province the MHC is at. It's in Manitoba, Wanda. Steinbeck, Manitoba. Ron, somebody mentioned that his dad, Wally, did conscious objector service at his uncle's manufacturing factory in Winnipeg. Was that common?
Yeah, there were exempt, so you could serve your conscientious objector duties either in alternative service work camps. As the war went on, so initially conscientious objectors, they were signing up for about 4 months of alternative service. As the war ground on, Canada needed more labor, and so they extended that alternative service to last the duration of the war. And in the later years of the war, then they put conscientious objectors in all kinds of industries where there were labor shortages or extra hands were needed. So a lot of conscientious objectors served in hospitals, mental hospitals, but also industry, food processing, mining, that kind of thing.
Great. And Alvin's saying he toured the POW camp in Riding Mountain National Park. Not much left except some concrete foundation stones. The site is reachable by bicycle from the Audie Lake campground.
I've never been there, but I have heard there's not much left there, but it's a very interesting part of our history that we probably don't think about in Manitoba, having a POW camp here.
Yeah. And Barry is asking, how did legislation aligning all education in Manitoba and Saskatchewan affect military involvement in the Second World War?
That's a good question. I don't know if anybody has the answer to that because it's kind of a what if. What if the Mennonites who came in the 1870s to Canada had not emigrated to Latin America in the 1920s? They were some of the more traditional groups, and they held on to some of the more traditional beliefs that Mennonites held. In 1916 in Manitoba and 1917 in Saskatchewan, the provincial government stepped in to mandate provincial education. So everybody had to go to government-run schools with government-certified teachers. The more traditionalist Mennonites decided that this was too much of an incursion into their right to raise their children the way they saw fit according to their religion. And so they emigrated to Mexico and Paraguay in the 1920s. So when you have the most traditionalist groups leave, that that takes away some of that impetus to hold on to some of those more traditional beliefs. At the same time, you have the 1920s Mennonite immigrants coming in. It's a stereotype, but I think there's some validity to it. They were more intertwined with the world around them. They were seen as more worldly. They had experienced alternative service in World War I in Russia, so they were aware of those kinds of opportunities. And so you have in the same breath almost the most traditional elements moving out of Canada and some more modern elements moving into the Mennonite community, especially in the prairies and in Ontario. And so that changes the face of the Mennonite community a lot. We do know that in World War I, not many Mennonites enlisted. I don't have the exact numbers on that, so don't ask me that question, but there weren't very many. In World War II, it was 4,500 is the commonly given statistic. So it's a huge leap. And so you wonder why those things happened. Public education, I think at the time where it was introduced was during World War I. And at the time, Canada wanted to make little Canadians out of all the immigrants. So there's British flags in the classroom. There's the portrait of the king. So they were raising nationalistic, and Mennonites felt also militaristic feelings as well. So it's sort of a what if kind of a question. What if something hadn't happened? But I think just my sense is that there would have been a very big impact of those 1870s Mennonites leaving Canada, or a lot of them leaving Canada, and then the effects of public education as well.
Thank you. Becky's wondering, what was the local attitude to Mennonites who decided to participate in World War II? Did they face criticism from other neighbors in the church?
It depends what Mennonite group you look at. So when we talk about the traditional groups leaving in the 1920s, not all of them left. So there were a good number of Mennonites from the 1870s left. They were more, I would say, probably more hard on the people who were returning, especially if they had joined the military. There are stories of people being asked to apologize to the congregation or recant what they had done in joining the military. There are stories of people losing their church membership over that, and churches of former Mennonites being started, next door to the Mennonite churches. So there are those stories, but it does depend on what Mennonite group you're talking about, and also if the people were actual members or not. Church membership often went very hand in hand with marriage. So if you were going to get married, you probably got baptized very soon before that date. So often when men enlisted, they weren't technically members of the Mennonite church. So if you're not a member, the church doesn't have as much of a say in your life as if you were a member. So it depends is the short answer.
And Karen mentions that you told the story of a Mennonite woman, and will the exhibit include more stories of women?
I had that question too from Laureen Harder-Gissing, and it really made me think, where's the women's story in all of this? And it's hard to capture because often when we talk about Mennonites and peace or Mennonites and war, it's often about the official ways that the church reacted to something, or how they interacted with the government, or whether the men went to war, or whether the men went to alternative service camps. In all of those kind of official stories, women don't have a voice there. They weren't in official leadership positions at that point. But trying to get the women's story, I think that's what makes Susan Jansen Siski's artifacts here, the musical jewelry box. I think that's what makes those things really special
Mm-hmm.
to our collection. Women were definitely affected, not just as refugees by the war, but also by their men being serving their alternative service requirements in camps, across Canada. Um, so there definitely are women's stories. They're harder to get at, and we're a museum, so I love the fact that my job is tied to physical artifacts, but then you're also hampered by what you don't have. And
Right.
so families often donate more official kinds of things. And I think a family would probably more readily donate an object that belonged to their father or grandfather who served as a CO, as opposed to their mother or grandmother who was the wife of a CO. That's just the way history has kind of been told, unfortunately, in families. So we're sort of hampered with what we have, but what we do have, we're going to be telling that story as well.
That's great. I love the story of the turning a binder twine into thread and how
Yeah.
creative, and that line you said, the protagonist of survival, about women being a protagonist of survival.
Yeah, I think that was from Marlene Epps' book. So
Yeah,
yeah, it was just a really neat thing to read and have that artifact in mind.
oh, it's beautiful. We're going to answer a couple more questions and then we're going to wrap it up. And Andrea the questions that we're not able to answer, we will send to Andrea and she'll be able to answer them by email if you have posted in the Q&A section. So I'm just going to look over the questions, looking for a good one here. Somebody was asking, oh, in the exhibit, will you be comparing the experience of Mennonites during wartime in Canada and the United States, or will it be mostly focused on Canada?
Mostly focused on Canada because our mission here at the museum is about Mennonites in Canada. So we do have some artifacts related to Mennonites outside of Canada, but because our mandate is Canadian, that's where we'll be focusing on. And then also some of the Mennonite experiences in Russia and the Soviet Union, as well as that relates to Canadian Mennonite experiences.
Great. And the final question, were farmers exempt from military service?
No, not as a class. There was nothing that said if you were a farmer, you were exempt. My understanding is that if you could prove that you were in an essential industry, you could get exemption to stay on the farm. But as a class, farmers as a class weren't excluded. That's the short answer. But you could get exemption to work on a farm for food production. So it's
Right.
a bit of a
Not,
tricky question.
not in all cases, but there were
Yeah.
some exemptions. Okay. Well, thank you everyone for coming tonight. And Andrea, you're receiving lots of thanks in the chat. And we really appreciate your well thought out presentation. And I trust that that exhibit will be very intriguing and something that you're not going to see every day, and lots of different kinds of artifacts related to stories that we don't often hear in Mennonite circles. So thank you again for coming this evening and making your presentation. And everyone, this is the final session in the series this fall, but we will be sending you out a follow-up email tomorrow, and we're going to have 5 more sessions starting in January. So you'll receive details about that. And if you like this series and you're up for 5 more in the dead of winter, we've got some good stuff coming for you. All right. Good night, everyone.
Good night.